On November 30, 1950, Harry Truman was asked whether the atomic bomb was under consideration in Korea, and this time no one walked it back. The words themselves were real, spoken in the White House press room that morning. Use of the bomb had always been under active consideration, and the theater commander, he seemed to say, would control its employment. In our timeline, the press office issued a clarifying statement that same afternoon, and Dean Acheson spent the next week explaining to Allied capitals that nothing had changed. In this alternate timeline exploration, we examine what could have happened and why the real history unfolded differently. Here, the clarification never goes out. Truman spends the afternoon not with the press secretary, but with Omar Bradley and the maps of North Korea, where the Chinese People's Volunteer Army, 180,000 men who had crossed the Yalu in October, is in the process of tearing the United Nations advance apart. Song Shilun's 9th Army Group has closed around the 1st Marine Division and elements of the 7th Infantry Division at the Chosin Reservoir. Edward Ulman's X-Corps is cut in pieces. The temperature is 30 below. Oliver P. Smith, commanding the Marines, is doing arithmetic that has no good answer. Acheson argues against it for 4 hours. Bradley, who does not want the bomb used and does not want to lose an army either, argues for the marshalling yards rather than the cities, for interdiction rather than annihilation. That distinction is the one Truman seizes. He is not, he tells them, bombing China. He is cutting a railroad under the Atomic Energy Act of 1946. The fissile cores did not belong to the military. They belonged to a civilian body, the Atomic Energy Commission, chaired by Gordon Dean, and no soldier could touch them without a written order from the President. That architecture was the whole moral premise of the post-war settlement. The bomb was not a weapon of the armed forces. It was an instrument of the state, held apart. Non-nuclear assemblies for Mark IV weapons had already gone to Guam in July. Only the capsules were missing. Truman signs. Gordon Dean, who has been a commissioner for a year and chairman for 4 months, receives the order and complies because the act gives him no ground on which to refuse. 9 capsules leave the continental United States. At Kadena, the weapons are mated and passed to Far East Command, to Douglas MacArthur, who has spent 5 years accustomed to being trusted. But the decision that mattered was not made at Kadena, and its consequences would not be measured in Korea at all. The 9th Bombardment Group flies in the first week of December. The targets are not cities in the language of the order. They are marshalling yards. Antung, at the Yalu bridgeheads, where every ton of Chinese ammunition crosses into Korea. Mukden, the industrial spine of Manchuria. Harbin, further north, where the rail lines from Soviet territory converge. Rail yards sit inside cities. They always have. That is what a rail yard is for. The distinction Bradley drew in the cabinet room does not survive contact with a Mark IV detonating over a working railhead in a winter inversion. Tens of thousands of Chinese civilians die in the yards and the districts pressed against them. Railway workers, their families, the crowded blocks of low housing that grow wherever freight is loaded. There is no accurate count. There has never been an accurate count. The Chinese figure and the American figure differ by a factor of 3, and both are guesses. What the bombs accomplish militarily is precise and undeniable. The rail arteries feeding the Chinese armies in Korea are severed at 3 points on the same afternoon. A logistics system that was already improvised, men carrying shells on their backs through mountains at night, because daylight belonged to American aircraft, loses the trunk it improvised from. Song Shilun's divisions are inside the Chosin perimeter when the supply spine behind them is vaporized. They do not know it yet. Radio discipline and terrain mean that for perhaps 36 hours, the encirclement continues to tighten, while its future is already decided 200 miles to the north. Then the ammunition stops arriving. Then the food. The 9th Army Group was already suffering catastrophically from cold. Thousands of frostbite casualties, men freezing in their firing positions in cotton uniforms issued for a different climate. Take away resupply, and the encirclement becomes a slow starvation of the encirclers. The Marines break out toward Hungnam. They still fight for every mile. They still bring their dead and their vehicles down the single road through Funchilin Pass. But they come out at a lower cost, and they come out onto a coast where the evacuation is less desperate than it was. Walton Walker still dies in his Jeep on December 23rd because that accident owed nothing to any bomb, and Matthew Ridgway still arrives to take 8th Army and remake it. Ridgway stabilizes a line. It will barely move for 2 years. The war does not end. It hardens. Clement Attlee had booked his flight because of the press conference. He arrives on December 4th to restrain a decision that has already been executed, and he is told so in the first hour. He has nothing to trade. Britain has detonated no weapon of her own. The consultation clause of the 1943 Quebec Agreement, which once promised that neither government would use the bomb against a third party without the other's consent, had lapsed in American practice and been superseded by an act of Congress. London has no veto. Attlee flies 4,000 miles to discover the precise dimensions of that fact and flies home with a communiqué. The government he returns to is not destroyed by the bomb. It is already dying. It came back in February 1950 with a Commons majority of 5. Ernest Bevin, the Foreign Secretary who had built the Atlantic Alliance, is gravely ill and will be dead within months. Hugh Gaitskell, Chancellor since October, is preparing a rearmament program the party cannot afford and will not stomach. Aneurin Bevan has been maneuvering against that program for a year. What Manchuria gives Bevan is not an argument. It is a constituency. He now takes the rearmament and the bomb together as his ground. The claim that Britain is paying for and consenting to a strategy she does not control, and the fusion of those two grievances is more than 5 seats can absorb. The cabinet fractures. The government loses its majority. The consequences of that fracture would reach much further than Westminster. But first, Moscow has to decide what a treaty is worth. The Sino-Soviet Treaty of Friendship, Alliance and Mutual Assistance, signed on February 14, 1950, obliged the Soviet Union to render military assistance if China were attacked by Japan or any state allied with it. Both Moscow and Washington read that clause as covering the United States. It has now been triggered in the plainest way imaginable, on Chinese soil, with atomic weapons. Stalin counts what he has. The RDS-1 device had been tested on August 29, 1949. By the end of 1950, the Soviet stockpile is roughly 5 weapons. There is no intercontinental bomber. There is no means, none, of putting a Soviet warhead over an American city. The asymmetry is not a matter of degree. It is a matter of category. He also knows what he has hidden. Soviet pilots of the 64th Fighter Aviation Corps have been flying MiG-15s out of Antung against American aircraft for months, and Washington knows it, and Washington has said nothing publicly, because to say it would demand a response. Antung is now a ruin. Some of those pilots are dead. Stalin's own men have been killed by American nuclear weapons, and the fiction that they were never there is the only thing keeping the war regional. Every option is intolerable. A nuclear reply with 5 weapons against a country holding hundreds invites annihilation and cannot even reach the enemy's homeland. Silence forfeits the leadership of the communist world to Mao, who has just absorbed the blow, who committed to this war over the objections of much of his Politburo, and who will now ask what the treaty was for. Peng Dehuai's armies are broken in the field. Stalin is not a man who chooses between courage and caution. He chooses between forms of survival, and the form he selects is one that history has not yet named. Moscow's retaliation, when it comes, is conventional and deniable, and it is aimed at logistics. Soviet submarines operate against shipping in the approaches to Japan and along the Korean supply routes. Aircraft, unmarked, strike the airfield complex at Kadena, the place the bombs were mated. Ships are sunk. Airmen die. No government announces anything. Both sides now share the same interest in the lie. Washington cannot admit that Soviet forces are killing Americans without accepting a general war it does not want. Moscow cannot admit it either. So the Soviet Union avenges Manchuria in a manner it will never claim, and the United States absorbs losses it will never attribute, and the war widens without crossing the threshold a second time. This is what deterrence looks like when it is running on one cylinder. Not stability, a managed hemorrhage. The front freezes. Not only the Korean front, the whole northeastern rim of Asia becomes a fortified band running from the Yalu down to the 38th parallel, dug in, permanent, garrisoned by both sides at ruinous expense for as long as anyone can foresee. Behind it lies contaminated Manchurian ground that neither government administers because neither wants to be photographed administering it. The rail lines are rebuilt around the dead zones. The dead zones stay, and the peninsula becomes the one place on Earth where nuclear weapons are known to have been used against a nation that had them, not against a country without recourse, as in 1945, but against an ally of a nuclear power, which then chose not to answer in kind. That is the lesson everyone extracts, and everyone extracts a different version of it. In Peking, never again without your own weapons. In Moscow, the bomber gap is the only thing that matters. In London and Paris, an American guarantee is not a guarantee, it is an American decision. There was never a treaty forbidding the use of nuclear weapons. There was never a law. In our timeline, there was only a habit, a practice that hardened year by year out of the fact that nobody used one until the not using came to seem like a property of the weapons themselves rather than a choice repeatedly made by frightened men. Habits are made of instances. Remove the first 5 years of restraint and you remove the thing itself. Here, the reflex hardens the other way. Nuclear weapons are not a category apart. They are the heavy end of the interdiction spectrum, released by the President, delivered by Bomber Command, useful against rail junctions. The Atomic Energy Act's central premise, civilian custody, the bomb held outside the chain of command, died the day Gordon Dean handed over the capsules, and no one rebuilds it because it failed at the only moment it was tested. Every subsequent crisis is planned with a nuclear annex that is not a warning but a menu. We tell ourselves that the taboo was inevitable, that the horror is self-evident, that no leader could have done otherwise. But Truman came within a sentence of it, and the sentence he actually spoke was walked back by a press officer that afternoon, not by any law of nature. The restraint was real, it just wasn't guaranteed.